of these questions may be given to Morgan because he probably just doesn't have it done, but he knows. Okay, I'm going to give the first question to Brady Rasmussen.
Yep.
Who is the man from the CIA who briefed President Kennedy and members of his cabinet about the situation in Cuba on Tuesday, October 16th, 1962? Marshall Carter, this guy right here. If you get interested in looking at any of these, this is Marshall Carter right there. Tiny, tiny signature. Okay, Dalton, you're up. What was the news President Kennedy received as they were discussing possible options for the crisis on Tuesday, October 16th, 1962?
That there are 25 merchant ships going to Cuba.
Very good. There were 25 Soviet merchant ships en route to Cuba. And of course, at that point, they understood that those ships probably had missiles on those. Okay, Hunter, why did Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell convince President Kennedy not to cancel his trip scheduled to Connecticut early in the Cuban Missile Crisis?
So the president thinks something was up.
That's it's a very good answer. So the press did not did not think something was up, or the press did not get word of the crisis. That would have been the worst thing ever. Okay, JC, I'm going to give you a pass on this because you've been singing beautifully for the last few days. Garza, you ready for this?
Yeah.
After discussion early in the crisis about airstrikes, followed by invasion, why did Bobby Kennedy look to Secretary of Defense McNamara for a better option?
Because if they attacked, they could possibly get into a war.
That's really not right. I mean, you got the concept, but that really wasn't his concern. Everybody knew if we attacked Cuba that more than likely they were going to make a move in Berlin. Taylor?
They didn't want like all the other countries, they were just concerned with Cuba.
You're very close. He saw it, this is a key term, he saw it as a sneak attack. A larger company bombing a smaller country, which he did not think would go over well at what? Okay? He was really concerned about a sneak attack, a larger country bombing a smaller country, which would look bad because who are they generally going to need support from in this whole thing? The United Nations. And it just would not look good worldwide for a sneak attack, for a smaller country getting knocked into oblivion by a larger country. So there's the better answer. Okay, Michaela, my dear, what possible scenario did McNamara present to XCOM after Bobby's inquiry?
A naval blockade?
A naval blockade of Cuba. Okay, a naval blockade of Cuba. Very good. Kendra, my dear, now this was a tough one, but maybe you got it. Concerning a comparison to animals, what statement did General Curtis LeMay make to President Kennedy after his recommendation of an immediate airstrike against the missiles and launching pads in Cuba? And we are justified in shooting him. And the big red dog wasn't the bastard, okay? That was a different quote, okay? So somebody had that confused today. I'm not sure who that was. But anyway, yeah, the big red dog is digging in our backyard, and we are justified in shooting him. Okay, good. Kellyanna, my dear, what did President Kennedy believe would be the response of the Soviet Union if the United States ordered airstrikes against Cuba to destroy the missiles and launching pads?
He thought that like the Soviet Union would retaliate, right?
Where?
In West Berlin.
Very good.
And would possibly get World War III started.
Absolutely. His concern was, his belief was that if we airstrike Cuba, that they will act in West Berlin. That their reaction would be to try to recover West Berlin. So why did President Kennedy believe, what did President Kennedy believe would be the response of the Soviet Union if the United States ordered airstrikes against Cuba to destroy the missiles and launching pads? They would retaliate in West Berlin, would be the best answer. They would retaliate in West Berlin. Okay, Sage, my dear. Prior to his scheduled trip to Chicago on Friday, October 19th, 1962, what specific thing did President Kennedy want his brother Bobby to accomplish before he returned?
Didn't he want him to do like something about like get like a consensus of
He wanted XCOM to have a consensus on what?
uh,
Either
blockade or air?
strikes. Okay, he wanted Bobby to get a consensus from XCOM. That's who's giving you the consensus. A consensus from XCOM on either airstrikes or blockade. Very good. Taylor, my dear, how did Kenneth O'Donnell finagle a way to get President Kennedy back to Washington, D.C. before the scheduled end of his trip to Chicago, or visit to Chicago?
He had Pierre Salinger tell the media that he had a cold.
Very good. He told Pierre Salinger to announce that the president had a cold and would be returning back to D.C. on the advice of his doctors. Okay? He told Pierre Salinger to announce to the press that President Kennedy had developed a cold and would be traveling back to Washington, D.C. on the advice of his doctors. Olivia? On Saturday, October 20th, 1962, once the option of the blockade of all ships into Cuba was chosen by XCOM, why did Secretary of Defense McNamara make it so clear that the action would be called a quarantine instead of a blockade?
Blockade sounded warlike.
That's exactly right. That's what I have to have. Blockade sounded warlike. It was an act of war. Okay? Lauren, my dear, on Saturday, October 20th, during a meeting of XCOM, why was CIA Director John McCone so outspoken in his opposition to the option of a blockade?
Isn't it because he felt like once too much time happened, he was like,
Sure. These two questions, 11 and 12, says, what was CIA Director John McCone's use it or lose it concern concerning the crisis in Cuba? So we'll kind of answer them together. If you look at the first part, on Saturday, October 20th, during a meeting of XCOM, why was CIA Director John McCone so outspoken in his opposition to the option of blockade? Is that the United States lost their first strike capability. Okay? The United States lost the first strike capability. We lost first strike capability, which means what?
Surprise.
Element of surprise, okay? First strike ability. Now, if you look at the next question that says, what was CIA Director John McCone's use it or lose it concerning the crisis in Cuba? Once we lost our first strike capability, the Russians, knowing we are coming, would use their missiles rather than lose them. In other words, they would launch them rather than lose them in the airstrike. So we've lost our first strike capability. We've lost the element of surprise. That's the answer to number 11. CIA Director John McCone's use it or lose it concern was the fact that if we lost our element of surprise, our first strike capability, they would launch the missiles, they would use them rather than lose them in an airstrike. Okay? Which was very dangerous because they could reach every American city in the country except Seattle. Okay? All right, where are we at here? We'll throw it over to Ivan because he looks like he's ready. Now be really good on this. On Saturday, October 20th, during a meeting of XCOM, what cowardly recommendation did Adlai Stevenson make?
He proposed a negotiation, and we would.
That's a real good way to start it, and we'll point it out. He chose a path of negotiation. And what did he want to negotiate?
He said that they would pull out missiles in Turkey, and then Soviets would pull out missiles in Cuba.
Okay, we're going to leave out Gitmo. We'll just leave out Guantanamo Bay. I mean, it was pretty insignificant. So basically what he's saying is we will trade our Jupiter missiles in Turkey for them removing the missiles and missile launching pads in Cuba. That was what he was really saying. Gitmo really was a pretty minor part of that thing. But he thought it'd give him a little more leverage. So rather than try to spell that and go nuts, we're just basically going to state that his cowardly recommendation was one of negotiation, which stated that he wanted us to trade our Jupiter missiles in Turkey for the missiles and missile launching pads in Cuba. Okay? So negotiation was his recommendation, and what was his recommendation? Trading Jupiter missiles in Turkey for Soviet missiles in Cuba. Okay, Caitlin, my dear, what, quote, word did Adlai Stevenson give Kenneth O'Donnell at a dinner party the night of Saturday, October 20th, 1962, that was of great concern of the crisis in Cuba?
That news of the United States
That's exactly right. You got to that New York Times part at the end. That news of our possible invasion of Cuba was going to be published the next morning in the New York Times. Okay, Maddie, once O'Donnell passed Stevenson's word on to President Kennedy, what were the president's actions to solve the issue at hand?
And the president called the editor of the New York Times.
Okay.
And just tried to reason with him, and he said that, like, they were saving lives.
Including
Their own.
their own. Yeah, and we'll get to Orville Dreyfus in a minute. You can just put on that he called the publisher of the New York Times and negotiated with him, and when the publisher was hesitant not to run the story, he asked, what am I going to tell my reporters? He said, you'll be saving lives, including your own. All right. I'm going to get back in order here. Jake, I know you can get this. Who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that was part of XCOM? Head of the whole thing. Army General. No, he was Air Force. He was the guy in the movie that was in the green suit, most acting and most in control. Not related to Aaron. Wasn't named after a coffee. He was in the Cuban Missile Crisis to the max. Wasn't feeling very well at times. Pete?
No, I wasn't planning on saying. I couldn't.
Oh, you don't know it either. So they're laughing at him. Who is it?
It's Maxwell.
Maxwell Taylor. He is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff that was part of XCOM. None of you guys have these done? These Tigger, I'll give yours back. Though you're not the only one. Yours to me like.
You said
We were just trying to
done.
whisper the
Mostly.
wrong one, too.
I had it mostly.
All right. Well, since you have it mostly done there, I'll ask you this question. Who is the National Security Advisor under JFK during the crisis? National Security Advisor. You got a 1 in about 10 chance there. Well, 1 in 9, or 1 in 9 now because we got one done. Who is the National Security Advisor under JFK? Well, he might have had a brother named Theodore, Ted, who was a murderer.
No one knows that.
Really? Who knows that? Anybody here know who that is?
No, I don't know that.
Who is the murderer?
No, I
Really?
don't.
Well, Ted Bundy.
Yeah, I know, but no one knows that.
Well, she did.
I didn't
Yes.
know, I guess, because you said his name was Ted.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So who was the National Security Advisor? McGeorge Bundy. Holy moly, what a loose cannon bunch. Elise, I know she's prepared. Elise, who was the former Secretary of State who was appointed to XCOM for his experience with the Russians?
Dean
Dean Acheson, that's right. Siobhan, my dear, who was President Kennedy's speechwriter during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Theodore Sorensen is exactly right. Theodore Sorensen. Casey back there, quiet as can be, hoping I don't call on her. Who was the Air Force general who told the president, quote, he was in a pretty bad fix? Curtis LeMay. Very good. Curtis LeMay. Huh? Okay, JC, I'm going to give you a shot here. No reprisals.
Okay.
Okay? Who is this is the toughest one. Who is the Soviet, well this is the easiest one because you got to look for a Soviet name. Who is the Soviet diplomat that denied the Soviets were placing missiles in Cuba during his meeting with President Kennedy?
Oh, I did a biography.
Oh my God, really?
Andre Gromyko.
How would I have known that? Andre Gromyko.
Yeah.
What do you think I set you up for that for? All right, I got to get you remembering better. Soviet diplomat that denied the Soviets were placing missiles in Cuba during his meeting with President Kennedy during the crisis, early in the crisis, Andre Gromyko. All right, picked on just about everybody, so I'm going to go back to Brady. Brady, who was the CIA director during the Cuban Missile Crisis who worried about losing first strike capability? John McCone. Dalton, who was the mayor of Chicago that JFK did not want to cancel his meeting with during the crisis?
Richard Daley.
Richard Daley, very good. Elise, who was the publisher of the New York Times who delayed printing of a story prior to Kennedy's national television speech concerning the situation in Cuba? Orville Dreyfus, very good. And last but not least, Siobhan, who was the man who determined that the objects in Cuba were Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles? Dino Bruganoni. Yep, very good. All right. Now, I'm gonna, I get that you guys have no idea on deadline things, not all of you. So I'm expecting that if we're not gonna have an overall test on all 3 of these worksheets at the end, that we will be a little better prepared when we do this the next time. Okay? Now, I don't think Tig was the only one by looking at blank looks on your faces. Okay? For those of you that are at the state drama, make sure you have these done by Monday at the start of the period. I'm just saying this to see if you're watching. Yeah.